Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're getting into a really fundamental question, one that pretty much every country grapples with. How do you balance order, stability, national survival against the demand for individual freedoms and rights?
It's a core tension, absolutely. And the sources we're digging into today really focus this through a specific lens, Pakistan's military leadership.
Exactly. It's universal, but here it feels particularly intense. Maybe because, as the material suggests, the struggle just to exist has often felt more urgent than guaranteeing specific liberties.
That's right. So this deep dive is based on some pretty extensive excerpts from Zaheer Ahmad Meer's book, Pakistan Generals, Stability, Rights, and the Army's Role. And our mission really is to try and understand the narrative presented in this specific material. How have different military leaders across very different times tried to manage this tightrope walk between keeping the state secure and respecting individual rights?
Yeah, and the paradox hits you straight away, doesn't it? I mean, usually we think of an army, its job is borders, external threats, that kind of thing. But this material really pushes us to look at how, time and again, the military institution in Pakistan was called on to be the ultimate stabilizer internally, preserving unity, law, order, basically stepping in when civilian structures seemed unable to cope.
They become sort of the final backstop for the state's structure itself.
Not just border guards, yeah, arbiters of the whole political system.
And this deep involvement, the book argues, isn't just random. It's deeply tied to how Pakistan came into being, born out of conflict, surrounded by regional instability, internal divisions.
A tough neighborhood from day one.
Absolutely. And in that kind of pressure cooker environment, stability stops being just like a desirable policy goal. It becomes synonymous with national survival itself. That existential pressure, according to the source, fundamentally shapes how the military views human rights. They're not seen as these untouchable absolutes, but more as, contingent on the nation actually surviving.
Okay, so we're looking at 4 different leaders, 4 different eras, and presumably 4 different approaches to this balance. So the key question for you listening as we explore these periods is really, what does the history laid out here tell us about how the military's idea of responsible freedom changed? And how did the methods used to enforce stability evolve alongside that?
Yeah, how did the tools change?
Let's dig in. Let's start right at the beginning.
Yeah.
With the first period of extended military rule. Okay, so first up is Field Marshal Ayub Khan. His time in power really set the initial template, didn't it? Establishing that core logic for why the military needed to step in and why order came first.
Absolutely. The foundational belief attributed to him in the sources is quite straightforward, but really powerful. Political stability isn't just nice to have, it's the absolute bedrock, the non-negotiable starting point for any real national progress, especially economic development.
He basically said, you can't build anything worthwhile on shaky ground. Political chaos is just too costly.
Exactly. We can't afford the infighting, the instability.
Yeah.
The argument was, if the house is constantly shaking, talking about fancy rights is a bit pointless because the whole structure might collapse, taking every right down with it.
So what was his mechanism for building that stability? The sources talk about the basic democracy system.
Right. Basic democracy. It sounds fairly democratic on the surface.
A bit benign, yeah.
Yeah.
But the sources are quick to label it as essentially controlled governance. Top down. Can you sort of walk us through how it worked? How did the book say it gave people a local voice but kept the real power centralized?
Okay, so the mechanics were designed quite deliberately to, let's say, filter political influence upwards. Instead of everyone directly voting for, say, the president or the National Assembly, like in many systems, it created tiers. At the very local level, villages, townspeople would elect representatives called basic Democrats. These individuals were supposed to handle local issues, administration, giving people a feeling of, direct participation in their immediate community.
Okay, local participation. But that wasn't the end of the story.
No, that's where the filtering comes in. These locally elected basic Democrats then formed the Electoral College. They were the ones who actually elected the president and the members of the National Assembly.
So it's indirect.
Highly indirect. And according to the source material, this was a very calculated design. The aim was to kind of dampen the impact of big national political parties and mass movements, which Ayub apparently saw as inherently unstable, prone to populism, maybe even corruption. It insulated the central government from direct popular pressure while still having that layer of local representation.
It sounds less like a system to empower people and more like one to manage them, which explains why critics, as the book notes, pretty quickly called it controlled democracy.
Precisely. It maintained control while providing a perhaps veneer of participation?
But, and this is crucial to the argument presented, this controlled system wasn't just about holding power. The sources stress that this period saw real, tangible successes. Stability wasn't just for stability's sake, it was stability for something.
That's the core argument presented for this era, yes. The order, which was imposed sometimes quite strictly, suppressing political dissent, is credited with fueling significant economic and infrastructural growth. And we're talking major foundational projects.
Go to the dams.
Exactly. The construction of huge dams like Mongla and Tarbela, absolutely vital for irrigation, for power generation. There was also a noticeable push in state-backed industrial expansion. And for a time, Pakistan's economic growth rate, the GNP figures, were actually quite impressive, held up internationally even.
So the narrative is the military imposed order, and that order allowed for essential development to happen, building the nation, literally.
That's the connection the source makes. The lesson derived from the Ayub era, as presented, is pretty stark, almost utilitarian. What good are unrestricted political rights if exercising them leads to chaos, hunger, economic disaster? The controlled order wasn't just control, it was framed as the necessary condition for achieving basic national prosperity.
Rights don't mean much if you're starving.
That's the essence of the argument. But it's also interesting how the material implicitly deals with why this eventually failed. While Ayub provided that material justification order leads to food, basically the sources suggest this stability was maybe too manufactured, too top-down?
It lacked real roots.
Perhaps. Suppressing genuine political feeling just bottles it up.
Yeah.
And when the economic miracle started to slow down, or maybe the benefits weren't reaching everyone equally, the political structure, because it lacked that deep democratic legitimacy, turned out to be quite brittle. It couldn't withstand the pressure.
So it set a precedent. Stability is foundational. But maybe how you achieve that stability matters just as much in the long run.
Exactly. It establishes the principle, but also hints at the potential pitfalls of achieving it solely through control without genuine consent or participation.
Okay, so if Ayub Khan's focus was order through, let's say, economic management and infrastructure, the next major figure we need to look at, General Zia-ul-Haq, represents a significant shift. We're moving from stability via dams and factories to stability via faith and ideology.
It really was a fundamental shift in justification, yeah. Zia's approach, as presented in the sources, wasn't primarily about economic indicators. It was about the moral and religious fabric of the state. He directly linked national stability, national survival even, with Islamic faith.
How so? What was the connection he was drawing?
The argument was essentially that external threats, which were significant at the time, could only be truly resisted if the nation was internally cohesive, morally strong, ideologically unified. And for him, that meant establishing a more explicitly Islamic order.
This wasn't just rhetoric then. The sources talk about specific institutional changes. It sounds like it went quite deep into the legal and social structure.
Oh, absolutely. This was about reshaping the state's identity. The sources highlight several key initiatives. For instance, the implementation of the Qudud ordinances. These brought specific crimes like theft, adultery, drinking alcohol under the purview of Islamic law, Sharia.
That's a major legal change.
Huge. Then there was the institutionalization of zakat collection at the state level. Zakat, the obligatory charity in Islam, became a mandatory levy collected by the state, transforming it from a purely private religious duty into a state-managed fiscal tool, ostensibly for social welfare.
So religion becomes part of the state's financial and welfare system.
Correct. And alongside that, the establishment of Shariat benches within the existing court system, creating a parallel track for Islamic jurisprudence in certain matters.
Now, the source material seems to argue that these measures, while obviously impacting human rights and drawing criticism on that front, were fundamentally about creating a kind of national discipline, a discipline deemed necessary for survival.
That's the framing, yes. The idea was that this shared religious identity and legal framework would foster a specific kind of disciplined society. And this internal discipline was seen as crucial for weathering external storms.
And how did the more traditional tools of military rule, like martial law, fit into this?
It was sort of a two-pronged approach described in the sources. On one hand, martial law was used quite firmly to restrict political activity, especially secular opposition, clamp down on dissent, maintain public order. But on the other hand, There was a simultaneous massive focus on building up defense capabilities.
This was during the Soviet-Afghan War, right?
Exactly. Pakistan became a frontline state, heavily involved, supported by the West. So the argument presented is that the internal faith-based cohesion Zia was trying to build was meant to make the nation more resilient, not just militarily, but ideologically, to withstand the immense pressures of that war and the regional fallout.
And the context was incredibly challenging. The Soviet invasion next door, millions of Afghan refugees pouring in, internal political factions. The potential for chaos was immense.
Definitely. And the sources emphasize that despite all this, Pakistan did survive. It didn't collapse under the strain. The implicit argument being made is that the kind of disciplined, faith-centered order Zia enforced was a key factor in the nation's ability to hold together during what could easily have been an existential crisis.
So the lesson here, according to the book, is different from Ayub's. Rights weren't necessarily ignored, but they were, well, reinterpreted, filtered through this lens of responsibility to the nation and to faith.
Filtered is a good word, or perhaps subordinated. The argument is that individual rights were seen as secondary to the collective duty to uphold the Islamic identity of the state and ensure its survival. It created an order based not on economic targets, but on ideological and moral conformity.
A very different flavor of stability compared to Ayub's focus on material progress.
Absolutely. It added this deep spiritual or ideological dimension. If Ayub established the economic case for military oversight order brings prosperity, Zia established the ideological one, discipline ensures survival. Both prioritize state survival over individual political freedom, but the basis for that prioritization is completely different.
And this framing must have changed the Army's perceived role, too.
Immensely. The sources suggest the Army's role evolved under Zia into something like a moral guardian of the state, blending military power with the enforcement of religious piety. This provided a much deeper, albeit far more controversial philosophical justification for its involvement in politics than just managing the economy. It also arguably set the stage for future tensions around ideology, both internal and external.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for our next leader, General Pervez Musharraf. We've moved from economic stability under Ayub to ideological stability under Zia. Musharraf steps in and he's facing a whole new world. The rise of global terrorism after 9/11, but also, crucially, the explosion of the information age.
Exactly. If the previous threats were, primarily economic or geopolitical in a Cold War sense, Musharraf inherited this rapidly changing landscape. He introduced his own concept, enlightened moderation, but his time is really defined by the struggle to manage freedom, especially media freedom, in an era of instant communication.
Controlled freedom seems like the operative phrase here, because the sources really emphasize that, unlike his predecessors, he oversaw a significant expansion of certain rights.
That's the paradox of his era, absolutely. He seemed to recognize that you couldn't just clamp down entirely in the 21st century, especially on information flow. So the defining characteristic, as highlighted in the book, was this deliberate, really unprecedented opening up of the media landscape. It felt like a major concession to freedom of expression.
Can we get a sense of the scale? The sources mention numbers, don't they? It wasn't just allowing one or two critical voices. It was more systemic.
Oh, it was systemic and revolutionary for Pakistan at the time. We went from a situation where the state broadcaster, PTV, and state radio basically held a monopoly on electronic news.
Right. The single source of truth, officially.
Yep, pretty much. To an environment where seemingly overnight, literally dozens of independent, private Pakistani TV news channels sprang up. Plus, numerous newspapers. They were licensed, allowed to operate, and they competed fiercely.
Wow, dozens. That's a floodgate opening.
It created this explosion of public discourse. Suddenly you had 247 news cycles, political talk shows with open debate, investigative journalism digging into things. It was, according to the book, the single biggest expansion of the right to expression in the country's history up to that point. Unseen openness.
But freedom, especially when it arrives that quickly in a place with deep existing tensions, often comes with complications. The sources are careful to point this out too, right? This new openness didn't happen in a vacuum.
Not at all. And this is where that controlled freedom idea gets really tested. This media boom happened right alongside the post-9/11 war on terror, massive regional instability, and Pakistan's own complex internal dynamics.
So what were the challenges that arose or intensified because of this new media freedom?
Well, the sources point to several things. First, the growth of extremist groups and narratives. Suddenly, these groups had potentially wider, faster ways to get their message out, even if indirectly through coverage or debate. Second, political opposition became much more visible, much more organized. They could use these new channels to broadcast grievances, mobilize supporters, challenge the government in real time.
The media became a battleground itself.
Absolutely. And the real flashpoint, the moment that perfectly captured this dilemma, was the judicial crisis.
Ah, yes, the suspension of the Chief Justice. That became huge news internationally, too.
It became the ultimate test case. Musharraf attempted to handle a high-level political challenge, the conflict with the Chief Justice, using perhaps the older playbook of state control, trying to manage it behind the scenes. But he was doing it in this new, hyper-transparent environment he himself had fostered.
So every move was being broadcast live.
Every protest by lawyers, every court hearing, every political statement was instantly beamed across the country on all these channels. The very media freedom he had allowed became the primary weapon used by the opposition lawyers, political parties, to rally support against him and ultimately weaken his authority. He was trying to ride two horses, maintain control, and allow openness.
And they ended up pulling in opposite directions.
Violently so, at times. So the core lesson from the Musharraf era, as the material frames it, is this. Yes, rights like media freedom can grow, they can flourish even under military oversight. But they exist in this constant, delicate balance with national security demands, and that balance becomes exponentially harder to manage in a digital, highly communicative world where information moves instantly.
The speed and reach just changed the whole equation for maintaining stability.
Completely. This era really highlights that fundamental clash between traditional state power, which often relies on controlling information, and the realities of the modern information age where control is much harder, maybe even impossible. The sources suggest that stability in the 21st century couldn't be maintained just by silencing people anymore. It had to involve managing, maybe integrating, that information flow, a much tougher job.
Which sets the stage for the next evolution in thinking. How do you manage it?
Exactly. It necessitated a whole new approach for whoever came next.
And that brings us right up to the current era and the leadership of Field Marshal Syed Asim Munir. He inherits all these complex legacies. Ayub's focus on economics, Zia's on ideology, Musharraf's struggle with media freedom, but now faces the challenges of a fully digitized, interconnected world.
Right. The context is now what the sources call a digital Islamic republic. And the core principle guiding the approach described is trying to achieve stability and rights not as a trade-off, but simultaneously.
So, moving beyond the idea that you have to sacrifice one for the other.
That seems to be the aspiration presented. The idea is that stability and rights aren't opposites. They need to actively coexist. And the way to achieve that, according to this perspective, is through accountability, efficiency, and leveraging technology. The argument becomes, rights are actually best secured when the systems guaranteeing them are stable and functional.
Okay, so how does that translate into practice? The sources link stability now very directly to economic and judicial performance. It's like the definition of a threat has expanded again.
Precisely. Economic vulnerability, corruption, inefficiency, these are now framed not just as policy problems, but as genuine national security threats. The sources highlight specific initiatives that connect justice and economic efficiency directly to national survival.
Let's talk about those. The material mentions the SIFC. What exactly is that, and why is it presented as being so critical for survival?
Okay, SIFC stands for the Special Investment Facilitation Council. It's described as a high-level coordinating body bringing together civilian and military institutions. Its main goal is to basically fast-track foreign investment, cut through bureaucratic hurdles, and make quick decisions to attract capital.
Why is that a survival issue?
Because the argument presented is that severe economic instability, things like crippling national debt, a lack of foreign currency reserves, inability to attract investment, is now seen as an existential threat. It's potentially as dangerous as a military invasion because it can collapse the state from within. So stabilizing the economy via SIFC becomes a core national security function.
So the military's role here is framed as facilitating economic stability to prevent state collapse.
Yes, clearing the path for investment, ensuring decisions get made. It's presented as a defense mechanism against economic implosion, which in turn is meant to secure the basic rights of the population, rights to employment, prosperity, a functioning economy.
And this is paired with other things, like anti-smuggling drives.
Exactly. The sources frame these big, visible anti-smuggling campaigns in a similar light. They're presented as essential reforms to plug leaks in the economy, stabilize the currency, improve tax collection, basically, enhance accountability, and stop illicit activities that weaken the state financially. Again, fiscal integrity is treated as a national security imperative, necessary for the state's survival, which then safeguards citizens' collective rights.
Okay, so stability through economic and fiscal discipline. But the really interesting part here seems to be the role of technology. It's not just about control anymore. It's positioned as a tool for rights and accountability.
This is where the approach feels distinctly modern, moving beyond how Musharraf just sort of reacted to the internet. Here, technology is presented as a proactive tool. We see emphasis on things like digital governance initiatives, new cyber laws designed to regulate the online space, and crucially, the idea of using AI-driven transparency.
AI-driven transparency. How would that work to protect rights?
Well, the concept suggested in the source material is that you can use AI and digital systems to make government processes, maybe even parts of the judicial system, more visible, more trackable. The idea is if processes are digitized and monitored by technology, it becomes harder for corruption or inefficiency to hide.
Reducing the human factor where things can go wrong or be manipulated.
That seems to be the goal. If accountability is harder to evade because the system itself is transparent and flags anomalies, then theoretically the rights of ordinary citizens, their right to fair treatment, to services without bribery, maybe even to quicker justice are better protected. It's like using technology to enforce a kind of systemic integrity.
Almost like using tech to achieve the kind of moral order Zia sought through ideology, but via efficiency and accountability instead.
That's a fascinating way to put it, yeah. It's aiming for a similar outcome, a well-ordered, functional state, but using very different modern tools. So the ultimate lesson being drawn from this current era, according to the source, is perhaps the most optimistic. Stability and rights don't have to be enemies.
They can coexist.
They must coexist, and the way to make them coexist is through this blend of technology, faith, the Islamic Republic context is still there, and rigorous accountability. The new paradigm presented is this highly integrated, hopefully accountable digital republic where efficiency itself becomes a form of delivering justice and securing rights.
So it's an attempt to finally square the circle, to solve that chronic dilemma using modern tools.
It seems to be. Instead of the stark choices of the past, clamp down with martial law like Ayub or Zia, or risk chaos with sudden openness like Musharraf initially did. The approach described here is about using systemic reforms driven by tech to stabilize the state while building in safeguards for rights through accountability. Whether it fully achieves that is, of course, the ongoing question.
Okay, let's try and pull these threads together. We've looked at 4 distinct periods, 4 leaders facing different challenges. Let's synthesize their approaches to this core balancing act as laid out in the source material.
All right, if you map it out chronologically, you see this really interesting evolution in what stability meant and how it was justified.
First, Ayub Khan.
His focus was order for material growth. Success was measured in concrete things: dams, factories, GNP growth. The justification was economic necessity. Stability meant prosperity.
Then Zia-ul-Haq.
He shifted it. Stability became tied to faith and ideological resilience. Using Islamic law, promoting a specific kind of discipline, was framed as essential to survive geopolitical threats. Stability meant moral cohesion and survival.
Then Musharraf.
He faced the paradox of the information age. It was about managing open media versus security, trying to allow unprecedented freedom while still controlling the fallout in a dangerous security environment. Stability meant navigating information chaos.
And finally, Asim Munir.
The focus now, as presented, is on digital accountability for coexistence, using technology, institutional reforms like SIFC to integrate rights protection with state stability. Economic failure is now a direct security threat. Stability means systemic integrity and efficiency.
So you've got 4 different primary threats being addressed: economic collapse, ideological fragmentation, information warfare, and now systemic inefficiency or corruption. And each threat prompted a different method of ensuring stability.
Different methods, different tools, different definitions of the problem. But the source material argues there's one consistent underlying mission cutting across all these eras.
Which is?
To preserve Pakistan, its unity, its dignity, its fundamental survival as a state. The way that preservation was pursued changed based on the perceived threat, And that, in turn, dictated which rights might be curtailed and which sometimes were actually expanded, like media under Musharraf.
And this leads us to the book's overall conclusion, which is quite provocative. It doesn't just describe these actions, it frames them.
Yes, and it's crucial to understand this framing comes from the source. The army isn't presented simply as a force that intervened. It's presented more as the guardian of responsible freedom.
Guardian of responsible freedom. That word responsible is doing a lot of work there.
It is. The framing suggests that these military actions, however controversial or unpopular, were seen internally as necessary course corrections. Necessary to prevent the state from collapsing entirely, which, in their view, would destroy all rights for everyone.
So the argument boils down to, you need the container, the stable state, before you can meaningfully talk about the contents, the individual rights.
That's the essence of it. This whole historical arc described in the book, from building dams under Ayub to implementing digital governance under Munir, is portrayed as this continuous, adaptive search for a way to make that equation work. The search for the truth, as the source might put it, that without stability, no right can genuinely survive.
If the state fails, if the economy implodes, if internal conflict rips the country apart, then individual liberty just becomes an abstract idea with no practical reality.
That, the source contends, is the untold story here. Not just interventions, but constant adaptation to keep the state viable, balancing faith, resilience, and evolving notions of rights.
It definitely forces you, the listener, to think critically about what freedom means when survival itself feels like it's constantly on the line. Does a right, in that context, automatically come with a responsibility, attached to responsibility to the nation's security?
The source material strongly implies that yes, it does, and it positions the army as the institution historically tasked with enforcing that responsibility, ensuring that the exercise of freedom doesn't jeopardize the state's existence.
So stepping back, the key finding we pull from this material is how dramatically the definition of responsible freedom and the main threat to stability shifts depending on the era. The mechanism the Army uses evolves too, from direct physical control to attempts at systemic, technology-driven accountability. But the goal, as presented, remains constant: protect the state itself.
Protect the core entity.
And this leaves us with a final, quite challenging thought for you, the listener, to consider. If we accept the premise presented in the source that stability is the necessary foundation for rights.
A big if for some, but let's follow the source's logic.
Right. If stability is paramount, does the specific method used to achieve that stability, whether it's martial law back then or sophisticated digital surveillance and economic controls today, does that method fundamentally shape the long-term character of the nation?
Does the tool used to create order leave its own permanent mark on the political culture, perhaps in ways that are hard to undo, regardless of the original intention?
It's a deep question about the relationship between means and ends in statecraft. How much does the how of achieving stability determine the what of the society that results?
A complex history indeed. Survival, adaptation, and this constant renegotiation of rights under the shadow of perceived existential threats. We hope this deep dive encourages you to think about how other nations, especially those facing chronic insecurity, try to manage the same fundamental paradox.
Thank you for joining us for this exploration of stability, rights, and the military's role, drawn from the perspective of Zaheer, Ahmad, Meer's The Generals of Pakistan.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive.
Until next time.